Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Jennifer Cory, as Dr. Hopkins said, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to be here, so thank you so much for that. I am the founder and chief hope facilitator of what is called the Hart Initiative, which is a community-centered organization born of my professional knowledge as a psychotherapist who works in the areas of trauma and resilience and my own personal experience with chronic disease. The Hart Initiative is the result of my deep desire to understand everything I possibly could about how to go beyond surviving with a chronic disease to thriving with a chronic disease. And then my desire to take those 5 years worth of research and knowledge and share it with other people. So let me start with my qualifying statement. Really, I think one of the things that qualifies me to be here and to do this work is that I am also somebody who lives with arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy. On April 11th of 2010, I was out for a long-distance run. I was in the 7th mile of that run when suddenly I started not to feel very well. My legs kind of felt very concrete-like, and I got very lightheaded. About a few minutes before that, I wasn't feeling well, and I had been running with a running partner. We were preparing for a race, and I think, I don't know, probably a more reasonable person said, I think I'm going to walk the rest of the way. But I said, and this seemed reasonable to me at the time, although looking back on it, I have to sort of laugh at myself. You know what, I'm not feeling well. I think I'm going to sprint the rest of the way. Yeah. And I wonder if anybody here can relate to that reasonable thought process. And so that may have had something to do with what was probably a slower ventricular tachycardia that just got kicked right up. Fortunately for me, I was 1 mile from an emergency room, and just a few days earlier, I had actually been on an island on a vacation with my family. And I, not every morning, about 4 or 5 of those mornings, woke up before dawn so that I could run about 3 miles out to a bridge to watch the sunrise, and then I would turn around and run back, which meant for about a 2-hour period, I didn't see another soul. And when I think about what might have happened had I been on that island, on that run, when this event happened, I really shudder. So I'm so grateful that I was where I was when this happened. 1 defibrillation, 3 hospital transports, and an MRI later, I was diagnosed with ARVC and fitted with a shiny new defibrillator. I was told to go home and live my life, and I was so grateful to be alive, and there was nothing more that I wanted to do, and I thought, boy, if anybody has the skills to be able to go home and do this, it would be me, a psychotherapist who's worked with people with trauma and resilience. What I hadn't expected was that the life that I was going home to was going to feel somewhat different than the life I had had only 6 days earlier. Trying to navigate a life with a chronic disease, and an heritable one at that, isn't as easy as it looks. So over the next 8 months, I would discover that my then teenage sons were also positive for the genetic mutation that causes ARVC. My mother would suffer a sudden cardiac arrest and she would die. I would be diagnosed with breast cancer and undergo a mastectomy. I would get my son ready for the prom. I would celebrate Christmas. I would adjust to one med and then another. I would go back to work, all while trying to navigate this new life with ARVC. So I consider myself incredibly blessed to live in a time where we can be diagnosed with a chronic illness that absolutely would cut life short at another time in history. And I know sadly that for many of us, myself included, we have lost loved ones to chronic disease, and in this case, ARVC. But we do live in a time where through the work and the efforts of Dr. Hopkins, Dr. Tandri, Johns Hopkins, all of the people, Brittany and Crystal and Cindy James and all the researchers, I don't think I've ever met a kinder or more dedicated group of people. I mean, we are the ultimate subset of a disease population. How this group of people came to care so much. So I consider myself so incredibly blessed to have survived from this sudden disease. But what I was left with was thinking, well, now what? What's the quality of life? How do you go forward with this? And I thought, if I'm struggling to try and figure that out with all that I know, what's everybody else doing? So I I want you to look at this number line as a representation of the range of psychological and social possibilities, also known as your quality of life parameters. And the same way that the goal of healthcare is to prevent death and treat disease and extend life, the goal of psychology is to identify suffering and treat clinical levels of anxiety and depression. But the same way that the absence of disease does not mean that someone is healthy, the absence of suffering does not mean that someone is thriving or even experiencing what's called sustainable well-being. Our true nature is not to be only free of pathology, but to experience a positive and meaningful life, to move forward, to have opportunities for continued growth. And this is the difference between surviving and thriving. And teaching people how to get to that place, to a thriving place, is a missing element in our healthcare system, although we've just had a beautiful presentation here at this conference on mindfulness, and I did one a number of years ago. But what I'm thinking about is a very strategic set of plans and interventions that are evidence-based in a training program that allow people at the time that they're diagnosed or sometime shortly thereafter to be able to learn the skills and tools that they need really to be able to move to that place of thriving. There's a difference in medicine and in psychology between what we call intervention, even though I refer to this program as intervention, and prevention and promotion. So I think back often to that period of time, April, May, June, July of 2010, before I got shocked, and while I was just trying to navigate those early stages, that how important it was to me to know the things that I did to try to keep my ship level. And how the people who don't have that, I completely understand how people end up sliding into clinical levels of anxiety and depression. And okay, so if you do, then we have treatment available, we have medication, we have psychotherapy, your insurance is even willing to cover it for many people. But what about subclinical levels of suffering? What about when you are dealing with anxiety and depression, but you wouldn't meet the clinical criteria for it, and so you're still functioning in your life, you're still going to work, but you know that something is off, right? So this is what I wanted for my own life, was to move to thriving. It's what I wanted for my children, and then I realized it's probably what everybody else wanted too. So let me tell you where I was on that line. I don't know if you remember that saying by Mark Twain, most men live lives of quiet desperation. I think it was Twain. But you see that period of languishing, low vitality between -2 and +2. The truth is that many people live their lives there, and they just kind of wax and wane back and forth, and sometimes they move up to a +4 or +6. Sometimes if they get hit really hard in life, they might move back to a -6 or even a -8, which is more of the clinical area. But we sort of wax and wane in that area, and there's nothing wrong with it. I think, though, that, again, it's our nature that most of us want to be living somewhere between the +6 and the +10 line. But if I'm being totally honest, where I was living my life prior to ARVC was probably somewhere right around a -4. A +4. Go that way. A +4. Now it looks much better. But a +4. And then once I was diagnosed with a chronic disease, the difference between a kind of trauma where it has a beginning, a middle, and an end is you're helping people move through something. And that's not to in any way diminish the significance of that kind of trauma. But if you have ongoing, what are called recurrent stressors that you're going to have to live with, in addition to just the normal life stuff, throughout the span of your life, well, this creates a different kind of drag in terms of the direction that you're being pulled on that number line. So if my normal disposition was, let's say, a +8 or a +10, maybe my drag would have been to a +6, and so what, right? But you know who makes up a +10? Between 20 and 30% of our population, meaning people for whom this is just their ordinary disposition. I was not one of those people. And then we have people, again, about 20%, who tend to be at the -6 and beyond, -6 to -10 line dispositionally. The rest of us who fall into that category, somewhere between -6 and +6, I think if you are diagnosed with something like a chronic disease and you are going to be living hopefully a very full, very long life in that state, then there's a certain kind of responsibility that we have to ourselves to build that muscle of resilience to be able to move further up that number line, just as our baseline. And I think there was a time in my life where that felt kind of indulgent, to be totally honest. I don't know if it was my Italian heritage or what, but I do remember walking in the door, and if you were smiling too big, my father would be like, "What are you smiling about?" And you're like, we were a very industrious group of people, and so I honestly think that I had my own bias against being kind of too happy. And so 4 was okay, but not anymore. It isn't anymore. If I'm going to live with ARVC, if I'm going to be a model for my children of what it's like to live with a chronic disease, if they're going to potentially have to face that in their life, then I understand how critically important it is to be able to create a baseline that's much further up that scale. So I set out a couple of years ago to learn everything I could possibly learn about the science of human flourishing, from research on resilience, which goes back to the 1950s, to the explosive fields of applied positive psychology, and everything in between. In 2015, I actually even went back to school for a second graduate degree, Master's of Applied Positive Psychology from the University of Pennsylvania, which makes me one of about 500 people in the world who have that degree. And I actually, it's a very competitive program, and so in my application process, I wrote all about wanting to create a comprehensive program of thriving for people with chronic disease, and that's how I got into the program. And my capstone was entitled ARVC From Surviving to Thriving, and it received an award of distinction from the University of Pennsylvania. This year, I received a small grant from the MAP community in honor of that capstone, and with the encouragement of going off and creating it into a program, which is how the Hart initiative was launched. So I've got to go over this really fast because I want to keep on time as much as I possibly can. So this is much more complex than I'm going to describe here, but I just want to hit on the most salient points, okay? When I look at all of this research overall, there are 3 of the risk factors that I think are most important to our community. And that is something called a negative attribution style. Annetta was speaking before about the way that we think. Well, here's sort of the fancier term for that, where thoughts, beliefs drive feelings, and feelings drive behaviors. And so I would refer to it as a misattribution style. And that looks something like this. My defibrillator goes off, and before I've even gone to the doctor and had it checked or anything, I'm convinced that this is evidence that I am degenerating and my disease has advanced, that I'm never going to be okay again, that I'm going to be disabled, that I'm going to need a heart transplant, and that I just end up spiraling down in that way. And so another one is, so that is seeing a negative event as personal, permanent, and pervasive. Another one is the external locus of control, which is, it doesn't matter what I do. There's nothing I can really do to make this better. I'm just going to be sort of, and I don't mean a victim like in a poor me sort of way, but in a helplessness and hopeless kind of position. Now, if you want to find yourself moving to the right of the 0 on that number line, this is exactly what it takes, is what's called a hopeless and helpless mind frame, frame of mind. The good news is we have antidotes to that. And so we've learned what the protective factors, and interestingly enough, so here they are, connections with others. This isn't all of them, but again, I just tried to consolidate the list. The ability to identify your own strengths and then know how to be able to use them. For most of us, our inclination is to develop our weak spots, thinking, I know what I need to do. I just need to go to the strength that I'm least adept at and build that one. But the truth of the matter is we know you get the most bang for your buck if you can identify, and there are ways of being able to do that, what your key strengths are, and learn how to really be able to lean into them. And how do we know that? Because when we have measured and evaluated what people in that top 20% of the right side of the number line are doing, the positive side of the number line, the left side, that's exactly what they're doing, is they are naturally very adept at understanding what their personal strengths are and then knowing how to be able to utilize them. Well, here's the good news. For the rest of us, that's a teachable quality. And a positive attribution style. And what a positive attribution style would look like is if something bad happens in your life, instead of seeing it as personal, permanent, and pervasive, you see it as universal, temporary, and local. So here's the quick and dirty on universal. Crap happens to everybody. This wasn't just me. I know I cleaned up my language for that. I wasn't sure if there'd be kids here, so I was like, don't use your jersey, just be good. Okay. So we heard Dr. Tandri, we heard a number of people today talk about the connection between the brain and the heart. I would say that this is incredibly important, this mind-body connection, for anybody who's dealing with a chronic disease. But could it be more important to anybody than the people in this room? So these are the two biggest energy centers in our body. And the heart is one of the most receptive organs in the body, and so it receives information from the brain and from the rest of the body, and the heart is just constantly sort of in flux and experiencing, reacting to what's going on around it. So remember, again, beliefs drive feelings, feelings drive physiology. It's not that that can't work the other way around, that loop, but I just want you to understand it as a continuous loop. And so being able to step in and break that loop or alter it in some way becomes critically important. So what are some of the ways that we've learned that you can do that? Well, certainly Netta was talking about using mindfulness strategies and using cognitive behavioral strategies. And if I had more time, I would show you another video. I actually refer to that as something else. Like if I were to say to you, Old MacDonald had a farm. Yes. I want you to know, by the way, that works in other countries too. So when I hear E-I-E-I-O, what I hear is event is the first E, outcome as the O, right? And we often go through life thinking that the event causes the outcome. That thing happened, and so I had this terrible fear. That thing happened, and so that's why I was so angry, right? But if you think about Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I-O, there's a slalom there that one must go through before you get to the O. And we miss that all the time. That's one of the things that mindfulness can allow us to do, is to slow down and catch that, right? So the first letter, we got E, the first letter after that is I, which is called your interpretation, right? And then the next one is E, which is your emotion. Guess what? It's the interpretation that drives the emotion, not the event, right? It is not the event, it's the interpretation. And then the next one is I, which is intensity. And that's where we feel the physiology of that interpretation and that emotion on our body. That's what creates the outcome, not the event itself. And if, as you said, we can slow down enough to be able to sort of catch that space in between. Viktor Frankl says, between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space is your liberation. But the thing is, we're so busy going on autopilot, we're moving so fast that we really have no consciousness around that. So to incorporate mindfulness and to be able to get connected to that gives us all this space to begin to be able to reconfigure things. So let's just say an event happens, and I interpret it as the worst thing that's ever going to happen, like catastrophizing, right? And then the next thing I know is emotionally I'm feeling very, very distraught and very hopeless. What if I catch it at the point of hopelessness? I still have the opportunity of rolling it back. But so even if you didn't catch it the minute the event happened, if you found yourself in that reaction mode, if you begin to practice something like mindfulness, you slow yourself down enough that you can catch it at some point in time in that process. It doesn't have to be a week later or a month later when you have created this, you haven't created, but this misinterpretation begins to create this spiral effect. The misinterpretation can lead to that sense of us feeling hopeless and helpless, which sends us further down. Well, things like positive emotions, becoming more cognizant and conscious of joy and serenity and gratitude and curiosity and hope and humor and inspiration and awe and love, these things actually create what's called an upward spiral. And so I want you to imagine that if you're living with a chronic disease, and so you're already vulnerable and susceptible to these downward spirals, we know that. We know that when you're diagnosed with a chronic disease, quality of life gets affected, negatively affected. Sometimes you are able to come back to what's called a homeostatic state. Like I said, okay, say your homeostatic state, your typical state is a positive 4. I don't know if that's necessarily going to be enough. It is if it's a one-time event, but what if it's an ongoing event? Then don't we want to try to head further and further up that number line so that we have more reserves of resilience to be able to mediate some of those things that we know are going to come? The younger you are when you're diagnosed, this isn't a question. We know with complete certainty that that has an impact on quality of life. If you have an ICD, impact. Now, here's the irony. Our ICD is a life-saving device that can have negative consequences on quality of life. How ironic is that? But the thing is, just as Netta was saying, we know that there are things that we can do to begin to reverse that spiral. Okay. Also, we talked about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. I was awful in A&P, biology in school, and so I can never remember which is which. So I actually make this for me. Mm-hmm. And so we know, like mindfulness, there are things that we can do, but there are other things as well. Alternate nostril breathing, called pranayama breathing. When we look at that in fMRI machines, we actually see the way that the brain lights up, so that instead of the sympathetic nervous system being hyper-reactive, which is what happens if you receive a trauma and a trauma and a trauma, or they don't even have to be major events. It can be a series of minor events over time that begin to build in this kind of avalanche, right? That doing something like alternate nostril breathing can help to level off the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And there are other techniques and tools as well. And for me, what I wanted to do was really draw on the evidence-based, the most well-researched, the most validated interventions that were out there, the things that the military was using, the things that were being used in schools where at-risk children were, the things that had a good, solid history of evidence behind them. So self-regulation, being able to regulate your nervous system, is another important component and something that gets covered in the Hart Initiative. Also, our ability to be able to lean into and use community. Remember, if we went back and looked at the slide of protective factors to trauma, one of them was people's ability to be able to connect to support system. Well, what is often our inclination? You know, in our let's call it an egotic inclination, our ego says, I don't want anybody to see me hurting. I don't want anybody to see me vulnerable. But if you've ever been on a plane that hits really significant turbulence, I don't care who you're sitting next to, you are going to reach out. That is our instinct, and we are literally overriding our instinct to what's called tend and befriend, to connect to people when we're in trouble, because our ego steps in and says, I don't want people to see me like this. And maybe we're doing it, we're really well-meaning and thinking, I'm doing this because I don't want to distress my partner. But we're also denying ourselves two things. One is the ability to deepen our connection with others, and that's one of the things that I cover in the Hart Initiative because of how critically important those relationships are. And the second thing is what happens to us from a physiological perspective when we make these kinds of connections with other people. So I have in my notes, dependency is one of our most successful collaborations. So here's an example. This comes from the field of applied positive psychology. This is called the Perma Model. This is one of 3 models of sustainable well-being. And I just put it up there just to show you real quickly. Here are what are called the key foundational areas: positive emotion, engagement, positive relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. And so this isn't a one-size-fits-all type of thing. There are a series of 14 validated interventions that can be utilized in any one of these areas. So a number of them, some of them have overlap, and there are interventions that cover all 5 of these areas. And if you think about this like an instrument panel in your car, then you know how you wouldn't drive without any oil in your car, any gas? Like at some point, even I think when we're unconscious, we have these momentary, wake-ups. Maybe the light comes on. What they call them, idiot lights, I think, or something, right? But it's to awaken us momentarily. But then we get to look at those gauges, I guess they're called, and see, oh, I need a little oil, or oh, the engine's running a little hot, and then we make a correction. This is exactly the same thing. They operate as gauges in your life. And when you begin to understand what a low level of one of these, how it manifests, you can begin to adjust for that so that you don't have to wait until you're in a clinical state. See, that's the difference. We're not waiting for pathology. We're talking about prevention and promotion, which to me is the next level of healthcare. So I want to say that it's not like any one of these events is going to feel life-changing to you, and you're going to think, oh my God, alternate nostril breathing, where has this been all my life? Okay? But what happens instead is that they act like seeds that we're planting. Each one individually may not feel so, enormous and so powerful and so impactful. But that's not what we're going for. We're not looking for the big change. We're looking for sustainable changes over time. Practices that you can incorporate into your life, some of which will be so simple and so effortless, but evidence-based practices, so we're not guessing. And there's nothing wrong with self-help, but that's not what this is. We're taking this directly from science and research in the field of optimal human flourishing. So thriving when there's an ongoing stressor is a complex process that requires tending and replenishment. It's not just about pulling weeds, but it's about planting seeds. And when we do that, some of those actions can feel insignificant individually, but together what we're doing is building positive emotion, psychological agility, improvement of self-regulation of the central nervous system. And collectively, they become incredibly powerful. This isn't only theoretical, although I've grounded the Hart Initiative in theory, and it's not only from research, although this has been informed by a ton of research. It's not only professionally, although I've watched my practice change profoundly since working through the principles of things like resilience and adding the elements of positive psychology with my client base. But I know it personally as well. That person who used to hover around a 4 and slide down to a -2 or 3 or 4 when things got difficult, now hovers around an 8, and often I can soar to a 10. Guess what? We all have an inner hero that's waiting to be awakened. And, I can't think of Chuck. When Chuck Love was talking earlier about Michael Moraski, what I saw was a hero, a man who, out of passion and love and devotion and trauma, losing somebody that he cared, created something so great. I would call that evidence of something like post-traumatic growth. We talk about post-traumatic stress all the time, but we don't really talk about post-traumatic growth. But I want you to go back and think about the heroes in your own life or the heroes in history. Rarely are they people who were just muddling along and then fell into something good. Often our version of a hero archetype is somebody who has been challenged to their very, very core and comes out not just meh, like the middle of the road, but actually begins to thrive after that, and maybe in some ways even as a result of it. Resilience doesn't get activated until there's a struggle. And Positive Help and the Hart Initiative are laying a path to shift from feeling hopeless and helpless, or maybe just being in a state of ordinary languishing, to thriving. I didn't want to settle for less than this in my own life. I did not want my children to have to settle for less. And I don't want you to have to settle for less either. That doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong, and it certainly doesn't mean you have to do anything differently, okay? This isn't a prescription. It's an offering. But what I do want you to know is that you have a choice, and then you can pick and choose what does or doesn't work for you, or not pick any of it at all, which is fine. But you deserve to know that you have a choice, and that we don't have to all be stumbling around a bit in the dark, picking up these disparate pieces and applying them to our lives, and that did or didn't work. And when we can collectively come together and work from something that is rigorously tested and science-based. Let's see. So this is my favorite quote about resilience. It does not happen by magical force. It occurs when ordinary people discover their best or highest selves under extraordinary circumstances. Resilience is the ability to successfully navigate life's traumas, trials, and challenges. Sometimes, as in the case of chronic diseases, those challenges are recurrent events that will require a lifetime of navigating. Fortunately, resilience is a muscle that can be built and replenished. Our capacity to resume functioning and to successfully adapt and even to thrive will be the result of the resilience that we build. So let me just tell you what HEART stands for. It stands for hope, engagement, action, resources, and thriving. And I call myself the Chief Hope Facilitator. And the reason that I chose that was I decided I wanted to play on CHF, which stands for congestive heart failure. I thought, wouldn't it be nice to flip that around? Okay? It has 3 goals, and that is to build a community around positive help, to develop and teach the skills of resilience in a supportive environment where people can help each other live those skills, and to collect data and share research so that we can close the gap between treating illness and attending to a high quality of life. I have already been graciously invited to return here next year for the 20th anniversary celebration to share the results of the work that I hope we're going to do together over the course of that year, and to share any data that I have collected. And let's see, there are things I always forget at the end, and I'm not allowed to this time. You know, I have a full-time job, and so I remember thinking, I mean, really, am I going to try to divert the path and dedicate my life, not my whole life, because I still have that job that I should probably do, to this? And when I received the grant, I felt very inspired, but I also felt overwhelmed and I felt lost. And I do remember thinking to myself, I don't think I said it out loud, I really could use a sign. And I have a very dear friend in Singapore. His name is Simon Lau. We met at the University of Pennsylvania. He took the same program that I did. He and I happened to be talking, and he said, how is it going with your capstone? He knew I had gotten this grant, and I said, I'm really kind of struggling. You know, I'm looking for help, but I don't even know what I need, so how do I know where to look? And he said, I think I have somebody who could help you. That's all he said. And about 24 hours later, I get an email from a man who just says, this is Buddha. I was like, well, that could be a sign right there. This is Buddha, and I'd like to hear more about your project. I think I could help. And Buddha is a gentleman from India who went and studied information technology in Singapore, became friends with my friend Simon Lau, is what I call a nomadic genius. And Buddha had work to do. First of all, he took on this project, and Buddha only takes on projects that he has believes have a deep sense of mission, has the potential to really change the world, and that he feels very deeply about. And he had a project that he was working on in the United States and was going to be traveling here in April, and said to me, how about if I come and we meet in New York, we work on some of this together, we see where we're going to go with it, and then I join you in Baltimore for the conference so that I can see the population that you want to help. And so Buddha is here. When I tell you, he's my technology officer, but here's the truth. Buddha is my chief cheerleader. He is my support system. He lights a fire in me when I feel overwhelmed, and I feel so grateful to have him. My sister and my husband are here too, Rocco and Virginia. They have been so instrumental in getting this project going. I don't think I can quite explain what it takes and how many nights I'm up till the middle of the night, except to say, I hope you all received this pin. If you didn't, please get one outside. It's actually the way that we've sort of created our business card. And so on the back it says what the HOPE initiative is. On the front is the pin. But they were up until the wee hours of the morning putting the pins that I ordered from China into the cards that I got from Texas that only got delivered to the hotel last night. And so they did that while I was up working on my slides until I don't want to say what hour. So I mean that to say that this is a community effort in every conceivable way. This is certainly not an I plan. It's a we plan. And I really would like to celebrate and share the fruits of that with all of you. So if you dial, there it worked. If you send a text to the number 44222, so you have to dial, I really didn't know how to do this. Somebody had to explain it to me. You get your phone and you open up the text message part and you put in that number, 44222, as if it's a phone number. Then you put in the words Hart JH, which stands for Johns Hopkins, and I don't think it matters if it's upper or lowercase. It doesn't matter. You will be connected to our program, and we'll ask you to share your email, and then when we're ready to launch our first cohort of it, which will be in a couple of weeks, we will send that information to you, and you'll know exactly how to get it. And as my thanks to you for being willing to sign up, if you are, I'm going to send you, I have a mindfulness meditation that I've recorded, and you're more than welcome to have that. And I have some resources of things you want to read, perhaps in preparation for the course, or even if you decide you don't want to take the course. But I'll share the things that I think are the most interesting and easy to read. So I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. No, I think that's it. We're covered.